Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 379. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. Today joined by co-host Connor Freeman. Connor, how you doing?
Doing great, Kyle. How are you?
Doing very well. Happy to have you back on today. Got a lot of news to get through. Just want to remind people, please take the time to share the show. We're trying to get it out there to more people. So wherever you're listening, if you're not subscribed, go ahead and hit the subscribe button. If you're already subscribed, share it out on your favorite social media or make it a recommendation to somebody else. With that, we'll get into the news because we got some important stories today, Connor. This one from Matt Taibbi on the Hamilton 68, and this was a website, a page that listed and claimed to have found this like vast network of Russian plants within the American Twitter sphere, and that this was huge in contributing to the whole Russiagate thing. So, Matt Taibbi points out here that thanks to the Twitter files, we can now welcome Hamilton 68 to this infamous club of media frauds that got something really wrong on the Russiagate thing. And Taibbi writes, if one goes by volume alone, this off-sided neoliberal think tank that spawned hundreds of fraudulent headlines and TV news segments may go down as the single greatest case of media fabulationism in American history. Virtually every major news organization in America is implemented, including NBC, CBS, ABC, PBS, CNN, MSNBC, the New York Times, and the Washington Post. Mother Jones alone did at least 14 stories paid to the group's research. Even fact-checking sites like PolitiFact and Snopes cited Hamilton 68 as a source. Hamilton 68 was a computerized dashboard designed to be used by reporters and academics to measure Russian disinformation. It was the brainchild of former FBI agent and current MSNBC disinformation expert Clint Watts, and backed by German Marshall Fund and the Alliance for Securing Democracies, a bipartisan think tank. The letter advisory panel includes former acting CIA chief Michael Morell, former ambassador to Russia Michael McFaul, and former Hillary for America chairman John Podesta, and one-time Weekly Standard editor Bill Kristol. The Twitter files expose Hamilton 68 is a sham. The secret ingredient in Hamilton 68's analytic method was a list of 644 accounts supposedly linked to Russian influence activities online. It was hidden from the public, but Twitter was in a unique position to recreate Hamilton's sample by analyzing its application program interface requests, which is how they first reverse engineered Hamilton's list in late 2017. The company was concerned enough about the proliferation of news stories linked to Hamilton 68 that it ordered a forensic analyst. Note the second page below lists many different types of shadow banning techniques that existed at Twitter even in 2017. But buttressing the Twitter secrets blacklist thread by Barry Weiss last month. Here you can see categories ranging from trends last blacklist to search blacklist to NSFW high precision. Twitter was checking to see how many of Hamilton's accounts were spammy, phony, or bot-like. Note that out of the 644 accounts, just 38 were registered in Russia, and many of those were associated with Russia Today, or RT. Examining further, Twitter execs were shot. The accounts Hamilton 68 claimed were linked to Russian influence activities online were not only overwhelmingly English-based, 86%, but mostly legitimate people, largely in the United States, Canada, and Britain. Grasping right away that Twitter might not be implicated in moral outrage, they wrote that these accounts holders need to know that they've been unilaterally labeled Russian stooges without evidence or resource. Other comments in the internal company emails show these accounts are neither strongly Russian nor strongly bots. No evidence to support the statements that the dashboard is a finger on the pulse of Russian information ops. Hardly any evidence of a mass influence campaign. And these are all statements from Twitter's internal communications counter in 2017, when we know that Twitter was highly biased against the Donald Trump and the Republicans at the time, and was more than willing to promote a lot of these, Russiagate fabrication stories. Declared Trust and Safety Chief Yul Roth said, "I think we need to just call this out on the BS," but he writes it out that it is. The two founders of Hamilton 68, the blue and red team of former counselor to Marco Rubio, Jamie Fly, and Hillary for America foreign policy advisor Lauren Rosenberger, told Politico that they can't reveal the names of the accounts because Russians will simply shut them down. One look at the list reveals the reasons they couldn't make it public. And so, Connor, we now know that this had nothing to do with Russia. It was an information, control operation for the American public. And there's a great article this week out by Ron Paul, and we reprinted it at antiwar.com, where he really explains the significance of this. And he says, thanks to the release of the Twitter files, we now know without a doubt that the entire Russia disinformation racket was a massive disinformation information campaign to undermine U.S. elections and perhaps even push regime change inside the United States after Donald Trump was elected president in 2016. Here's some background. November 2016, just after the election, the Washington Post published an article titled "Russian Propaganda Effort Helps Spread Fake News During the Election," experts say. The purpose of the article was to delegitimize the Trump presidency as a product of a Russian disinformation campaign. There is no way to know whether the Russian campaign proved decisive in electing Trump, but researchers portrayed as a broadly effective strategy of sowing disinformation in U.S. democracy and leaders, wrote Craig Timberg. The implication was clear: a Russian operation elected Donald Trump as president, not the American people. Among the experts, it cited an anonymous organization called Propernaut, which in its words claimed to identify more than 200 websites as peddlers of Russian propaganda during the election season, which combined audiences of at least 15 million Americans. The organization's report was so preposterous that the Washington Post was later forced to issue a clarification, even though the Post provided a link to the report, which falsely accused independent media outlets like Zero Hedge, antiwar.com, and even the Ron Paul Institute as Russian disinformation. The 2016 Washington Post article also featured expert Clint Watts, a former FBI counterintelligence officer who went on to found another outlet hunting Russian disinformation in the U.S., the Hamilton 68 Project. That project was launched by the Alliance for Securing Democracy, a very well-funded organization containing a who's who of top neocons like William Crystal, John Podesta, Michael McFaul, and many more. Thanks to the latest release of the Twitter files, Matt Taibbi revealed that the Hamilton 68 Project, which claimed to monitor 600 Russian disinformation Twitter accounts, was a total hoax. While they refused to reveal which accounts they monitored, and they would not reveal the methodology, Twitter was able to reverse engineer to determine that the 600-odd Russian-connected accounts were just not. Twitter found that despite Hamilton's claims, the vast majority of these Russian accounts were English-speaking. Of the Russian registered accounts, numbering just 63 out of the 644, most were employees of the Russian outlet RT. And so, Connor, that their big scam here is picking up on that some RT writers are on Twitter is not very much of an actual, uncovering a disinformation plot whatsoever. It was all a lie, and the latest Twitter files confirmed that even the woke pre-Musk Twitter employees could smell a rat. The hoax served as an important purpose, hiding behind anonymity. This neocon organization was able to generate hundreds of media stories slandering and libeling perfectly legitimate organizations and individuals as Russia agents. It provided a very convenient way to demonize anyone who did not go along with the approved neocon narrative. And Connor, I think this is probably the most important point here that I think a lot of conservatives miss about Russiagate is that it wasn't really an anti-Trump campaign. It was, a campaign targeting the anti-imperialist, and it just so happened that, Trump said some anti-imperialist things from time to time, but as we saw from his presidency, he really had never any intention to follow through with them. Now, Connor, I want to move on and talk about this article that me and you wrote for the Libertarian Institute on February 1st. U.S. to open 4 new sites in the Philippines, accelerating the pivot to Asia. Washington and Milana are close to inking an agreement that would see 4 new American installations open in the Philippines. The new sites are part of an American military buildup in the Indo-Pacific to prepare for war with China. According to the Washington Post, negotiations are ongoing, but the deal between the Philippines and the U.S. is nearing completion. Once completed, American forces are expected to have at least 4 new sites at Philippines bases. 2 of the new facilities will be located in the northern half of the country. The military sites are expected to be used in a future war between Washington and Beijing. The bases could give U.S. forces a strategic position from which to mount operations in the event of a conflict between Taiwan or in the South China Sea, the Post reported. In 2012, then President Barack Obama adopted a more aggressive policy for China, the pivot to Asia, the largest military buildup for the U.S. since World War II. Under the strategy, Washington has authorized billions of dollars for new bases, ships, and weapons to be deployed to the Asia Pacific. The Pentagon aims to encircle China with 2/3 of all U.S. air and naval forces. The increasing military activity has led to a string of deadly accidents in the region. A series of U.S. warships have collided with civilian vessels, resulting in dozens of casualties. In 2018, an F-18 collided with a refueling aircraft off the coast of Japan, killing 6. The Joe Biden administration has accelerated the military buildup in the Pacific. Last week, the Department of Defense opened a new base in Guam. At the end of the year, the Pentagon awarded contracts to begin work on new research installations in Palau. The relationship between the Philippines and the U.S. has strengthened since Ferdinand Marcos Jr. became the president in June. The previous leader of the Philippines, Rodrigo Duterte, threatened to end the visiting forces agreement between the Philippines and the U.S. and even floated the idea of increasing ties with China. The Philippines and the U.S. converging views of the region has facilitated the agreement for the new bases. Washington sees Beijing's territorial claims in the South China Sea and over Taiwan as crucial threats to the U.S. enforced international world order. Marcos realizes the dynamics of the region at the moment and that the Philippines really needs to step up, a Philippines official told the Post. The official added that Marcos has been monitoring the developments in the Taiwan Strait and the West Philippine Sea. The Biden administration has repeatedly promised the U.S. military will come to the Philippines' defense in the event of a violent conflict with China, including in the South China Sea, potentially over the disputed Woodston Reef. In a recently obtained memo, a 4-star Air Force general warned officers in his command that he believes the U.S. will fight China in 2025. And we'll get to that in just a second, Connor, but I want to mention 2 other stories first. First, the U.S. opens an embassy in the Solomon Islands to counter China. The U.S. on Thursday opened its first embassy in the Solomon Islands as part of a strategy to counter China in the region. Beijing has forged stronger ties with the Pacific Island nation in recent years. The State Department notified Congress early last year it would be opening an embassy in the Solomon Islands around the same time the Biden administration released its Indo-Pacific strategy. The strategy calls for the U.S. to expand its military and diplomatic presence in the region as a part of a buildup against China. The U.S. previously reported and operated an embassy in the Solomon Islands, but it closed in 1993. According to the AP, the new embassy is starting small with a charge d'affaires and only 2 State Department staff and a handful of local employees. The Solomon Islands started moving closer to China in 2019 when they severed diplomatic relations with Taiwan and opened up with Beijing. The move actually put the Solomon Islands in line with U.S. policy, but U.S. officials were alarmed about the Pacific Island nation moving closer to China. The Solomon Islands enraged officials in the U.S. and Australia last year when they signed a security pact with China. Under the deal, China can send police and other security forces to the island. Australia has claimed the agreement could lead to China building a military base, but Solomon's prime minister insists that won't happen. The prime minister has slammed the Western pressure on at his company, at his country, liking it to being threatened with an invasion. We deplore the continued demonstration of lack of trust by the concerned parties and tacit warning of military intervention in the Solomon Islands, that their national interest is undermined in the Solomon Islands. In other words, we are threatened with invasion, he told Parliament last May. The criticisms of the prime minister's decision to sign a deal with China came as the U.S. and NATO began funding the war in Ukraine in the name of supporting the country's right to choose military alignment leading up to the invasion. Russia asked the U.S. to guarantee Ukraine won't ever join NATO, but the Biden administration refused to make the promise. State Department spokesperson Ned Price said in March 2022 that the war in Ukraine was about protecting the principle that each and every country has a sovereign right to determine its own foreign policy, has a sovereign right to determine for itself with whom it will choose to associate in terms of alliances, its partnerships, and what orientation it wishes to direct its gaze. And again, that's only true as long as you're directing your gaze towards Washington. Now, this is very important, Connor. NATO chiefs calls for a stronger partnership with Japan on Tokyo visit. The head of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization visited Tokyo on Tuesday and called for NATO to forge a stronger partnership with Japan as the alliance has eyes on the region after labeling China a systematic challenge. And Connor, this is something we've covered a lot, so we don't have to go into a lot of detail today. But this is just another piece in NATO's puzzle of, extending itself seemingly around the world into all the world oceans, particularly now in the Asia Indo-Pacific region. And then this we mentioned at the end of our article, Connor. I'll just say that a 4-star general thinks that war between the U.S. and China is only 2 years away, and has ordered his forces to start preparing for the conflict. And he says, "I hope I'm wrong, but my gut tells me that we will fight in 2025. And this is General Mike Minihan, the head of Air Mobility Command, and he commands nearly 50,000 airmen, and the command oversees about 430 aircraft. And then I think he was like telling, to like make your wills out and everything like that. So he was telling the soldiers to take this pretty serious. Very concerning, Connor. And now I'm going to hand this one over to you and give us an update on what's happening with Iran.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is from January 26th by Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. So we ended our last show talking about these massive drills that were being carried out in the Mediterranean Sea and in Israel with the United States and Tel Aviv. It was the largest exercise they've done in their history. And so we'll get through some of the details here. And then there's been even more escalation since then. Israel has attacked Iran, and so we'll get to all of that. But to start with, last Thursday, Washington, Tel Aviv concluded these exercises that are known as Juniper Oak 23. So this involved 140 aircraft, nearly 8,000 troops from both militaries, although the vast majority were American troops. The massive show of force was clearly a provocation toward Iran, despite claims from U.S. officials and all these they were all virtually press releases in mainstream press about this, about these exercises, including the one we read from NBC. But they all say that, it's not about Iran, but, I'm sure they're going to take notice from all this. And so, they were talking about Russia and China and how we can flex our muscles in this other area of responsibility, as they call it, So anyway, CENTCOM's statement, their press release, says that U.S. Central Command and the Israel Defense Forces concluded Juniper Oak 23.2, the largest U.S.-Israel partnered exercise in its history. And then CENTCOM boasted that the drills included a live fire exercise that involved these are quotes, B-52s, F-35s, F-15s, F-16s, FA-18s, AC-130s, AH-64s, 12 naval assets, high-mobility rocket artillery systems, multiple launch rocket systems, a mix of jet fighters and long-range bombers. And so besides sending a message to Iran, the massive exercise demonstrates that the U.S. has Israel's back in the region, despite Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's government, which has pledged to expand settlements in the West Bank and eventually annex the territory. And of course, murders Israel's murders of Palestinians in the West Bank are already up this year compared to the same time period last year. They've before the end of the month, before the end of January, they had already killed, I believe, 30 Palestinians. And they just launched a massive attack on the Jenin refugee camp for hours that went on, where they were just actually including sending bulldozers through the refugee camp, just turning over every car that they could see. They killed 9 Palestinians and launched, I believe, rocket strikes on a house that they claimed was housing militants. And they murdered a 64-year-old woman by shooting her in the neck and then just letting her bleed out, or 61-year-old woman. And they prevented ambulances from getting in, and fired at ambulances as well. It was absolutely insane. But Biden's message is that whatever Trump gave you, we'll give you even more. So that's the status quo, I guess. But Netanyahu's new government is also full of these ardent Iran hawks, including his national security advisor, Shaki Hanegbi. Before the new government was formed, Hanegbi was threatening that Netanyahu would attack Iran if the U.S. doesn't negotiate a stricter nuclear deal, which is a joke, or take military action itself. Both the U.S. and Israel have been threatening military action against Iran to prevent it from acquiring a nuclear weapon. But the Pentagon, of course, as we've stressed, has declared in its recent nuclear posture review that Iran is not trying to build a nuclear bomb, which everyone already knows. But of course, this doesn't change the fact that they're building up for a war with Iran. And if Israel wants a war, they can just start one, and America will immediately be dragged into it. So Juniper Oak came after Israel's former army chief. This was Aviv Kohevi, the former chief of staff of the IDF, visited Washington, D.C. in November and said upon his return that the two countries would expand joint military cooperation. Now, this next story is from Jason Ditz at antiwar.com, again from the 26th. IAEA chief falsely claims Iran could fuel several nuclear weapons. So Rafael Grassi is at it again. In comments made to EU lawmakers last week, the IAEA chief tried to raise the alarm about Iran's civilian nuclear program, claiming that Tehran, if it so chose, could fuel several nuclear weapons from its existing uranium stockpile. This accusation is a continuation of Grassi's past suggestions, fueling immediate media frenzy about a proliferation threat and showing a flagrant lack of understanding for the facts of a nuclear program, let alone the status of Iran's stockpile. Under the suspended JCPOA nuclear deal, Iran was to send excess uranium from its stockpile abroad to keep it from growing too large. As a result of the U.S. illegally and unilaterally exiting the deal, as well as reimposing sanctions, no one is taking that excess uranium now and hasn't for years. And the stockpile just keeps growing steadily, with some 70 kilograms of 60% purity uranium amassed at this point. And of course, they weren't enriching to 60% uranium hexafluoride until after the Israeli attacks on the Natanz nuclear facility, their main center for building centrifuges. And that was after the indirect talks began to return to the JCPOA, which the Biden administration, after postponing, finally entered into in April of 2021. And as I always point out, Robert Malley had one job, and it's been a complete deliberate failure. So now the important facts of the case, however, are more practical and generally ignored in the press. As Jason says here, the term weapons-grade uranium refers to uranium which could be used in an atomic weapon. And at a minimum, you need 90% enriched uranium, 90% purity. Iran's highest level of enrichment, even years after the JCPOA fell apart, is still only 60%, well short of weapons grade. And I believe they announced in 2021, and we covered it on the show, that and I don't remember if it was the chief of their the Atomic Organization of Iran that said this, but they had an official declare that we will never exceed 60% enrichment, and they don't really use it. They don't use it for anything except for this leverage to try and bring the Americans back to the deal. It does not work, and it was in response, as I said, to these Israeli attacks, which caused massive explosions and power outages at the nuclear plant, which is obviously extremely risky and could cause a huge disaster. Yeah, no, I mean, they now have 70 kilograms built up of this 60% enriched uranium. So and Iran has never attempted to produce uranium more highly enriched than this, and its much vaunted stockpile consequently includes no weapons-grade uranium to fuel any weapons at all. The IAEA is no doubt aware of all of this, but consistently presents the highly enriched uranium of 60% as a problem. This both parrots U.S. efforts to spin anything the Iranians do as a threat and ignores the U.S. role in the stockpile being so large in the first place. At the end of the day, 60% uranium is still no direct proliferation risk without substantial further processing, which Iran has neither attempted nor have they proven themselves to be capable of doing that. Now, these IAEA comments are always spun as warnings about Iran. It would be more reasonable to make this concern about the United States and the rest of the P5+1's inability to get America back into compliance with the JCPOA. Now, Iran has demonstrated all the willingness in the world to get back into the deal if the other nations do, but the U.S. has resisted, and that's delaying the entire process, leaving the current status quo in place. 60% uranium keeps being produced, but has nowhere to go other than the stockpile. Rather than the U.S. being induced to get the JCPOA back on track, the Biden administration has responded with yet more sanctions to punish Iran, though ironically, Iran isn't in violation of any existing agreements now since the U.S. blew apart the only material deal on nuclear enrichment. The IAEA comments risk further harming the environment for more sideline talks with Iran on monitoring and giving the EU Parliament the impression that this is an Iran problem and not a problem with saving the JCPOA from Washington. All right, now this next one is from Dave DeCamp. This is pretty major. This is from February. No, actually, I think this is from the 29th, actually. Now, this is report. Israel was behind drone attack on Iranian military facility. So the Wall Street Journal reported on Sunday that Israel was behind an overnight drone attack inside Iran, which targeted a military facility in the city of Isfahan. Iranian authorities said 3 small quadcopter drones targeted a munitions factory in Isfahan. The authorities said that air defenses shot down one of the drones while the other 2 exploded above the building, causing minor damage but no casualties. The Journal report cited unnamed U.S. officials and people familiar with the operation who said the attack came as the U.S. and Israel, quote, look for new ways to contain Tehran's nuclear and military ambitions. The report said the attack took place next to a facility owned by the Iran Space Research Center, which has been sanctioned by the U.S. for allegedly being involved in Iran's ballistic missile program. The New York Times also reported a drone attack on an Iranian military facility that resulted in a large explosion in the center of the city of Isfahan on Saturday was the work of the Mossad, Israel's premier intelligence agency, according to senior intelligence officials who were familiar with the dialogue between Israel and the United States about the incident. Now, we'll get to this later, but I have a note here from a story I picked up from Al Jazeera this morning. Now, today, Tehran blamed Tel Aviv for the attack. In a letter to the UN chief, Iran's UN envoy, Amir Saeed Eravani, said, quote, primary investigation suggests Israel was responsible for Saturday night's attack, which Tehran, again, said caused no casualties or serious damage. But in the letter, he says, Iran reserves its legitimate and inherent right to defend its national security and firmly respond to any threat or wrongdoing of the Zionist regime wherever and whenever it deems necessary. He added, this action undertaken by the Zionist regime goes against international law. Now, Israel has a history of launching similar covert attacks using these small quadcopter suicide drones inside the Islamic Republic. So, in May 2022, a few dozen miles south of Tehran, quadcopter suicide drones attacked the Parchin military complex. The drones hit a building used for drone development and killed a young engineer. In February 2022, Israel used 6 quadcopter drones in a strike targeting another Iranian drone facility in Kermanshah, which did significant damage and destroyed a large part of their drone fleet, at least reportedly. Now, later in March, there were reports of more Israeli attacks, including on yet another drone factory in Tabriz, where as many as 3 people may have been killed. About 1 year earlier, in June 2021, we talked about this quite a bit because it was a huge scandal with the IAEA. Ironically, this nuclear facility in Karaj was hit by an Israeli drone and resulted in damage to cameras that belonged to the IAEA. And basically, Iran for months said, well, we won't even replace these cameras unless you at least censure Israel or at least admit that they're the ones who caused this damage instead of always criticizing us and acting like it's our problem and our fault. And eventually they did. But it took many, many months for the IAEA to even acknowledge that. And meanwhile, we've talked before about how Grassi was palling around with Naftali Bennett, basically talking up the threat of the Iranian nuclear program, which is a laugh considering Israel illegally has somewhere between 100 and 300 nuclear weapons that they're not a party to the safeguards agreement or anything. So I don't even know what. And the Iranians called that out immediately. It was just too hypocritical on its face to be taken seriously. Now, so the report said that the incident marks the first attack inside Iran under the new Israeli government of Benjamin Netanyahu, although he has overseen, of course, plenty of covert operations inside Iran under the previous governments that he led. Critically, the attack comes as the U.S. and Israel are stepping up their joint military coordination and just concluded their largest ever joint exercise, which was seen as a major provocation toward Iran, of course. Now, the U.S. and Israel have been discussing ways to counter Iran's growing military relationship with Russia. CIA Director William Burns made an unannounced visit to Israel last week to discuss Iran, among other things. The U.S. wants to disrupt Iranian military supplies to Russia, although the Iranians insist that they have not been providing drones to Moscow since the invasion of Ukraine. At this point, it's not clear if the drone attack is related to the war in Ukraine. However, Mikhailo Podolyak, an advisor to Zelensky, to Vladimir Zelensky, made a point to comment on the incident. He said, "Explosive night in Iran" on Twitter. He goes, "Ukraine did try to warn you." Podolyak had previously called for the liquidation of Iranian facilities that produce weapons. Israel has rebuffed requests to send weapons to Ukraine and wants to avoid raising tensions with Moscow. This is because Israel frequently launches airstrikes in Syria. They bomb Syria just about every week. And they have an understanding with Russia over the operations, although Moscow occasionally calls for the Israeli attacks on the country to end, although nothing ever really of consequence happens. Okay. Now, this next one is from Dave DeCamp. This is from... I think the date in my notes I think is wrong, but this is Iran summons Ukraine envoy over Israeli drone attack comments. So Iran's foreign ministry on Monday summoned a Ukrainian envoy over comments made by the advisor to Zelensky after the apparent Israeli drone strike in Isfahan on Saturday night. So following the drone attack, Podolyak, as I said, wrote on Twitter, "Explosive night in Iran, drone and missile production, oil refineries. Ukraine did warn you." Now, according to AFP, the Iranian foreign ministry called Podolyak's comments strange and biased. The ministry summoned Ukraine's charge d'affaires in Tehran for an official and immediate explanation from the Ukrainian government. Both the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, as I mentioned earlier, reported that Israel was behind this attack, on this facility, which Iranian media has described as a military workshop. So that's pretty much it. I'm not sure if there's been any more updates on that. Of course, we know that when this scandal initially blew up in the summer about and later on in the fall about Russia receiving or using Iranian-provided drones in the war in Ukraine, there were moves made on both sides from Tehran and Kiev to come to the table in a third European country and worked this out because the Iranians wanted proof of what was going on. They wanted to make sure that their weapons were being used in the war. They insisted that, as I said, that they were not sending drones they weren't selling drones to Russia once the war had begun, and they did not know that they would be used for that purpose. And they were going to work something out, but that was squashed by the United States and Germany. And interestingly, before that, scandal broke out, Tehran was actually working as an intermediary between Moscow and Kiev, relaying messages back and forth from each side. And in fact, they presented Moscow, the Iranian foreign minister presented Sergei Lavrov, his counterpart, with a message from a prominent Western leader believed to be Emmanuel Macron, the French president, an idea for a peace deal last year to end the war in Ukraine, but nothing really ever came of that. Now, this next story is from Dave DeCamp. Netanyahu says sanctions and credible military threat is how to deal with Iran. All right, so this is from the 1st of February. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said in an interview with CNN on Tuesday this week that the best way to deal with Iran is with sanctions and a credible military threat. And so he sounds like Yair Lapid again. So if you have rogue regimes that are intending to get nuclear weapons, you can sign 100 agreements with them. It doesn't help, Netanyahu said. Netanyahu played a major role in convincing the Trump administration to withdraw from the JCPOA. Of course, the agreement made Iran's nuclear program, their civilian nuclear program, subject to the most stringent inspections in the world and in the history of the IAEA, and capped uranium enrichment at 3.67%, vastly below the 90% required for weapons grade. As the Pentagon recently acknowledged in its nuclear posture review, Iran is not developing a nuclear weapon, but as we've said, they've increased their nuclear activity since the U.S. withdrew from the deal and launched the maximum pressure campaign. Following the Israeli assassination, of Iranian scientist Mohsen Fakhrizadeh in November 2020, when Netanyahu was prime minister, Iran brought its enrichment up to 20%. This is uranium tetrafluoride. Israel was also behind an April 2021 explosion at Iran's Natanz nuclear facility, which coincided with the U.S. and Iran holding these indirect talks on reviving the JCPOA. And after that incident, that's when Iran began enriching to 60% with the uranium hexafluoride. And that's the highest level, as we said, that they've ever attempted. And despite the fact that Iran's heightened nuclear activity is the result of sanctions, covert attacks, assassinations, and the lack of a nuclear deal, Israeli officials still point to it as evidence that Tehran can't be negotiated with and call for force. Netanyahu said, "I think the only way you can stop or abstain from getting nuclear weapons is a combination of crippling economic sanctions, but the most important thing is a credible military threat." Often missing from the U.S. and Israeli narrative about Iran is the fact that Israel has a secret nuclear weapons program that is not subject to any inspections. Current estimates put Israel's arsenal somewhere between 90 and 300 warheads, and every U.S. president since Nixon has agreed not to press Israel to sign the Non-Proliferation Treaty. In 2021, reports said that President Biden and Israeli former Prime Minister Naftali Bennett renewed this long-standing agreement. In exchange for not being pressed to sign the NPT, Israel doesn't declare its nuclear program and operates it in secret. And because of foreign assistance laws, amendments made to foreign assistance laws in the 1970s, there's a great piece by Grant Smith about this up at antiwar.com and Mondo Weiss. And I believe it's called "Israel's Nukes Make U.S. Aid Illegal." But technically, all U.S. aid to Israel as a result of their illegal clandestine nuclear weapons program, all U.S. aid is illegal. And of course, the real rub is Tehran has been a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty since 1970. All right. Now, Iran formally blames Israel for drone attack in Isfahan. So Dave DeCamp wrote this up this morning, and there's just some more notes here that I want to point out beyond the story, beyond the stuff I got from Al Jazeera earlier. So Iran on Thursday formally blamed Israel for the weekend drone attack on a military facility in Isfahan. A few days after U.S. officials speaking to the media said Israel was responsible. So again, Eravani, in his letter to the UN Security Council, said further instances of the Israeli regime's acts of terrorism and sabotage, as well as violations of international law against the Islamic Republic of Iran. He wanted to draw attention to this, as he said, to this terrorism and sabotage and violations of international law. Now, according to the Iranian account, the attack was launched with 3 micro-aerial vehicles, MAVs, which is what they're calling the quadcopter drones that Israel employs in these attacks inside Iran. The letter said that the drones targeted a workshop belonging to the Iranian Defense Ministry and did minor damage after being targeted by air defenses. The letter mentioned threats against Iran made by Israeli officials and how Netanyahu did not deny that Israel was behind the drone attack in his interview with CNN this week. Netanyahu said, "I never talk about specific operations, and every time some explosion takes place in the Middle East, Israel is blamed or given responsibility. Sometimes we are, sometimes we're not," Netanyahu said when asked about the attack. The letter asked the Security Council to condemn the attack and said Iran has the right to respond. The Islamic Republic of Iran reserves its legitimate and inherent right, in accordance with international law and with the UN Charter, to defend its national security and respond resolutely to any threats and wrongful actions by the Israeli regime, it said. And now the most worrying thing here, although, and we've discussed this before, if Israel attacks Iran in this kind of way, like where Netanyahu used to threaten Obama to get him to really escalate the dirty war in Syria, sort of blackmailing him, like, well, I could just attack Iran's nuclear facilities, and then we can just sort of see how it plays out. Everyone knows that if Israel launches an attack like that, that's worthy of starting, where the Iranians respond and a war gets started, that it's essentially an American declaration of war on Iran too. And so the Iranians are pointing that out. So Iran's are discussing. Let's see. So Iran's permanent mission to the UN told Newsweek that if the U.S. is involved in any such attacks, it means war. Quote, in Iran's perspective, the use of the military option at any level means U.S. entry into the war, the mission said. But the mission said that for now, the possibility that the U.S. was involved is weak. A Pentagon spokesman told Newsweek that they could confirm that no U.S. military forces have conducted strikes or operations inside Iran. But it's interesting that they talk about this in the context of, like in the Wall Street Journal piece, where they say that, but this comes as the U.S. and Iran are working on ways to the U.S. and Israel are working on ways to contain Iran's military ambitions, which is pretty ridiculous given the context. So that's the update. We'll have to see what happens here next week, but. Yeah, it's really ridiculous, the fact that this is they've made such there's not going to be any movement towards diplomacy for at least until not the Biden administration is never coming back to the table. It doesn't look like it. And the fact that they're using this argument about drones, which has always stunk to high hell with us, because look at all the drone attacks that Israel carries out on Iran. It's absolutely ridiculous, but the empire is extremely hypocritical, and so you can't expect anything less or anything more.
All right, Connor, thanks for that update. Everybody will be back with more shows next week, and keep an eye on the Libertarian Institute for more news articles. Thanks, Connor.
Thank you, Kyle.